All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Cameron Hudson. I'm a senior fellow in the Africa Program here at the center, and it's a great honor and a privilege to welcome Thérèse Kayikwamba Wagner to CSIS, the foreign minister from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country which has been, I think, on Washington's radar considerably over the past months and years. And so I think it's a really propitious time for you to be in Washington. You're coming, obviously, at a time of transition for us, but also I think a lot of movement and dynamism and even hope, dare I say it, in the region. So this is a great opportunity for us to explore with you some of your priorities, your country's challenges, and how you, how you intend to go about tackling these challenges and opportunities that you have on your plate. I want to just give a very brief introduction of the minister because she comes with a really unique and varied background of professional experiences that have, I think, sort of tailor-made her for the position that she is in right now. She has played roles in the peace process in her own country and in the region, joining the United Nations peacekeeping missions, working first with MONUSCO and also with MINUSCA in neighboring Central African Republic. She has worked as a special assistant and then the political advisor to the United Nations Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. She has been, again, in other capacities with the UN and most recently, interestingly, with Meta as the regional program manager for Sub-Saharan Africa. So really a diverse set of experiences. She holds degrees from Johannes Gutenberg University, a degree in human rights and democratization from European Inter-University, a postgraduate diploma in humanitarian assistance from Fordham University, and, lest we leave out, a master's degree in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. So it's an honor to have you here and to kind of tap into your experience and expertise going back now 20 plus years in this space. So I want to just open very generally with asking, what brings you to Washington today, 6 weeks before we have a transition here, only a week after President Biden was in the region interacting with your president, Felix Tshisekedi. What is on your Washington agenda right now?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone being here and the others who are connected. I think it's a great opportunity to interact with you and with your audience. CSIS has always been on the forefront on strategic discussions, including on the African continent, so for me also a particular honor to be here. What brings me to Washington? I think as you mentioned, we are looking at a transition, which is already ongoing, but at the same time, we're also looking at decades of a strong partnership between the DRC and the United States of America, and a partnership that has withstood the tests of time and of changing administrations. And so my engagements here in Washington, D.C. were primarily to already have a first impression of how we can ensure that despite a change in administration, we maintain our focus on the shared interests between our two countries, on very strategic projects such as the Lobito Corridor, which was at the heart of President Biden's visits to Angola, and also how we continue very strategic and important discussions for the DRC, but also for the greater Great Lakes region on peace and security and stabilization, where the US has always been a steadfast ally, not of the DRC, but of the region as a whole, and where we want to emphasize the need to maintain that focus and maintain that commitment, even in the context of a changing administration.
So you touched on, I think, what's probably on the top of mind for many people in Washington, which is the instability and conflict in the eastern part of the country, which has plagued the country for 30 years. Frankly. And so there seems to have been some new developments. in the Luanda process that has been going on. Again, it was a topic of conversation, I believe. You could correct me. When President Biden was in Angola last week, and he convened or invited leaders to come to Lobito, but to have discussions, I think, that were broader than that. Can you give us your assessment today of where not so much the conflict stands, but where the peace process stands? What has made the Luanda process different from the previous processes that have preceded it and not been successful? And what hope do you hold out, especially for this upcoming meeting, that leaders in the region, your president, President Kagame, will have in just a few days' time?
The Luanda process has been ongoing for a few months now. Upon my appointment, it was already ongoing, so I jumped on the train, so to say. I think one specific aspect that we as a DRC have been emphasizing throughout the talks is precisely to draw the lessons from past processes, from past agreements that have been signed, because as you say, there have been decades of instability, insecurity in the DRC, but also in the wider region. Regional conflicts have plagued the DRC. They play out in the DRC, but they are not specific and only proper to the DRC. So in our efforts to contribute also to successful talks and a successful peace process, the DRC has always emphasized the need to make sure that we draw the lessons from the past. The Luanda process has had a few important milestones. The first one being the entry into force of a ceasefire agreement on 4th of August. Another important milestone was reached on November 5th, when the DRC, Angola, and Rwanda met in Goma to establish a reinforced ad hoc verification mechanism that was tasked with monitoring the ceasefire agreement. Because we noticed, despite the ceasefire entering into force on 4th of August, that there were skirmishes, that there were violations of ceasefire, but that there was a limited capacity to monitor the ceasefire and to hold the parties who had violated it accountable. This is the reason why on November 5th, this mechanism was put in place. Another important milestone is the signature of the CONOPS, the Concept of Operations, on 25th of November, which meant that on both sides, Rwanda and the DRC, there was an agreement in terms of the specific operational commitments that both parties had to engage in and had to commit to in order to address respectively the grievances of one another. So I think this kind of maps out, the progress done to date. It's work in progress because it really is work. I think it's much easier for men, especially for men, to start a war. It's much more difficult to end a war, and it really is work. So, these are important milestones, but at the same time, whilst we look ahead towards the next meeting, the meeting of the heads of state on the 15th, which will be preceded by a ministerial meeting, it's about making sure that we, look towards the adoption of an agreement that takes stock of where we have come from, the challenges that we have seen throughout, and that responds to that adequately. And I think the issue of accountability and of making sure that all parties that adhere to a peace process and a peace agreement and sign it are held accountable, both by the facilitator, but also by the international community, the different partner countries that have been accompanying this process and contributing to a conducive environment. And I think this is going to be, as it is the case for every agreement, the real litmus test. We have seen in the region, and we have seen in other regions, a lot of agreements being signed. The challenge is implementing an agreement. The key to the implementation of an agreement is accountability. And this is where we come to all stakeholders with a message of sustaining their political commitment and the monitoring of the situation so that they hold all parties accountable.
So let me just kind of dig into that a little bit, because on both sides of this debate, I think your colleagues in your homologue in Rwanda might say something similar about DRC support to FDLR forces in the country. Can you speak about what commitments your country is prepared to make in terms of severing ties or support to those forces to help build the confidence and trust that you're talking about to make this a successful outcome?
I think one very crucial difference between the two countries is in terms of policy and policy positions that both countries and governments defend. It has never been a policy decision or position of the DRC government to protect or to collude with the FDLR. We have received reports from the United Nations group of experts, and we have sanctioned individuals who have colluded with the FDLR. It is not an official state policy. Now, we understand that it is a grievance. We understand that the FDLR represent a threat, predominantly a threat for the Congolese citizens, because they operate in the DRC and they prey predominantly on Congolese citizens. So for us, it is a priority to neutralize them. And when we say it, we believe it. And this is one of the pillars, if you want, of the CONOPS, of the commitment that both parties are going to make. On the one hand, the DRC that commits to neutralizing the FDLR, which would not be the first time in history because we have carried out numerous operations, military operations and sensitization campaigns to neutralize the FDLR or encourage those who are willing to surrender to return back to Rwanda. The other pillar is the disengagement of Rwandan forces from the DRC territory. So one grievance addressed by one party, the other grievance also addressed by the other party. Now, this is where rhetoric and posture are very different. As I said before, it has never been a DRC policy to collude with the FDLR, and we have sanctioned individuals who have done so within our army. We are perpetually perplexed to see that Rwanda has yet to denounce the fact that it has over 4,000 troops on our sovereign territory. And for us, it is a government policy, and it is a clear position that the government upholds. And this is a big difference, if you want, in terms of how we deal with these two grievances. But again, moving forward in the peace process, these are the two main tenets, if you want, of where our two countries are supposed to come together and find a resolution, if you want, to these two issues. On the one hand, the DRC will commit and has committed to neutralizing the FDLR. On the other hand, the Rwandan Defense Forces have to leave our sovereign territory. Even if publicly Rwanda speaks of defensive measures, the reality is that occupying a sovereign territory has nothing defensive about it. It is offensive, and it is a violation of international law. But this is what Rwanda has committed to responding to and withdrawing its troops from the DRC.
And do you feel like your government has the capacity, it has the necessary means to make good on this commitment of neutralizing the FDLR? Do you have what you need now to be able to do
We have done it before, and we are also intent on working with international partners, including the MONUSCO peacekeeping mission, in order to respond to this request. And as I said before, it is not the first time that the DRC is going to carry out operations against the FDLR. We carried out operations in the context of Umoja Wetu in 2008 with the RDF. We thought they would get the job done, or we thought we would get it done once and for all, but we see decades later that apparently it's still an issue. We carried out the Sokola 2 operations with MONUSCO peacekeeping operation, or the peacekeeping troops. And so there have been numerous efforts, and we have never shied away from associating other forces, associating other expertise in order to make sure that we reach the objective and we are as efficient as possible in our efforts to neutralize the FDLR. We have also worked together with Rwandan authorities because, again, when it comes to operations targeting the FDLR, there is a military side, but there is also the dimension of combatants surrendering and disarming, and this is where we have worked together with the Rwandan National Demobilization Commission that has been, taking care of former FDLR who decided to lay down their weapons and to return to Rwanda and reassume civilian life. So this is always an effort where we make sure that we associate the expertise that is necessary to help us reach the objective.
So let me go back to something that you talked about earlier in terms of sort of the confidence building and the information sharing. One thing that we've seen from Washington, since you're in Washington and we here at CSIS are always looking at, what is the role for the United States in all of this? And the United States has played a role. It's been uneven over time. But I think one of the innovations that certainly the Biden administration has been pointing to recently is this idea of intelligence diplomacy, right? So our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Lavigne, traveled to the region last year and set up what they called at the time a kind of intelligence fusion cell, to really, I think, shed light, bring transparency to the battlefield dynamics so that there was a shared understanding by both sides of what forces were where, what they were doing, what the intention was when there were movement of forces, that it was understood. Can you talk a little bit about what role that has played over the course of the last year? Because again, I think that selfishly from a U.S. perspective, I think there's an appeal because we do have an advantage, a comparative advantage in being able to collect this kind of intelligence, right? And so if we can bring transparency and we can help build confidence through the sharing of information, then could this be a model that is used in other parts of the continent or other parts of the world? You don't have to go that far, but I'm curious as to your assessment of the role that Washington has played in the last year, again, in the intelligence sharing, but then even more broadly in terms of the political support that it has tried to bring to the conflict.
I think, as you mentioned, the intelligence fusion cell played a critical role in bringing together stakeholders that otherwise would not have come together. Again, we are in a context of very high tensions between both countries. And so the ability to have these kinds of channels between experts can diffuse tensions, can make sure that conversations are on point and on specific issues, and that has played a critical role. Not just a critical role, as you say, in terms of information sharing, which is very important, but also a critical role in accountability. I think it makes a big difference when you have around a table experts who are not politicians, who are in a secluded context, if you want, who are not under scrutiny, and especially not under public scrutiny, to have these very frank conversations based on information that has been gathered by a third party, but a third party that is perceived by all as credible, that is perceived by all as balanced and as objective. And I think it helps propel conversations beyond these political the political posturing, if you want, that you have in such a conflict setting. So I think that played a critical role in terms of moving the needle, but also in terms of making sure that all actors had a more or less common understanding of what the reality on the ground is, which also means that there is an element of accountability, which means that you interact in this context knowing that everyone is looking at the situation from the same standpoint of, standing point in terms of information. And I think that was critical in terms of pushing these reflections on very specific and operational issues. Of course, that has to go hand in hand with the political process. That has to influence and that has to inform the political process. And this is where it's much more difficult because, again, you have this public scrutiny, both at the domestic, the regional, and of course the international level. And that at times complicates things. The U.S. played a critical role in these two levels, the intelligence level diplomacy, but also the higher level diplomacy that concerned specifically the ministers of foreign affairs during the peace talks, as many other countries did. It was very critical, and it still is critical, to have, even though the Luanda process is a very small process, is also a very limited scope of stakeholders when it comes to the discussions, to the peace talks. It's very important to always contextualize this in the bigger picture of a conducive environment, of partners like the US that keep an eye on the process without being within the process, and that still hold all the parties accountable, and therefore contribute to shepherding the process forward. And I think that has been a critical role, this interplay of feeding into a more rational, objective reflection on the realities on the ground at the expert level, and also making sure that at the diplomatic level, at the political level, there is also a level of follow-up, but also of diplomatic pressure to make sure that the efforts stay on course. But I think the biggest challenge is precisely the harmonization, if you want, of the realities on the ground and what happens in the diplomatic spheres and what happens in the ministerial level, where the politics also kick in.
So then what do you hope a final outcome looks like? I mean, we seem to have some momentum here. There seems to be some movement and willingness, I think, to make some concessions and some hard compromises. What's interesting too is that on the ground in Eastern DRC, there continues to be cross-border trade, and life in many ways looks very normal. And so, how do you reconcile those two, realities, and what does a final outcome look like that you're going to be not just satisfied with, but that's going to be durable? Because again, we have seen the ebb and flow of this conflict over many years and many decades. What is the durable outcome that you think both sides are going to be able to live with?
I think it would be speculating for me to say what outcome both sides would be willing to live with, because it would be difficult for me to project myself into the interests that are driving Rwanda and Rwanda's foreign policy in all transparency. For the DRC, the best outcome, but also the only outcome, is a return to the international rules-based order. I do not think that our region, the Great Lakes region, and as you say, a region that is characterized by dynamic contacts and relationships between communities, trade, that is characterized by so much potential, transformative potential, not just for the region, but for the entire continent. This region will not survive. This region will not seize its potential if we do not respect the international rules-based order. And so for us, and we believe it is also and ought to be the perspective of the region, the best case scenario is one where we all respect international borders, international territorial integrity and sovereignty. And I think once these rules are re-accepted and re-embraced by all stakeholders, it will pave the way to partnerships that are more durable. It will pave the way to peace that is more durable, and integration that fosters greater peace and stability. And I don't think that it is too ambitious, and I don't think that it is out of this world, because these are the rules that we have all accepted as member states of the United Nations.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot away from conflict and talk a little bit about opportunities. Because there's lots of opportunities as well. Obviously, the conflict hangs over. It casts a long shadow.
Of course.
Certainly, from a media perspective, it also casts a long shadow, which I think negatively impacts the opportunities, and there are many opportunities in DRC that the United States sees, but that our competitors see, and our friends, our allies, and our adversaries. So it has become very much a I don't want to use the word battleground, but it has become a subject of considerable focus among great and middle powers alike over the
Aspiring
course.
powers.
Aspiring powers. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about those challenges and opportunities that come with being the object of desire of many. And I want to talk first about the mineral sector, because that has, the Biden administration, and I think even the Trump administration incoming, have made very clear the strategic interest that the United States has as an economic power, as an industrial power, to maintain not just access to minerals in the DRC, but more broadly creating supply chain security for the global economy. And I'm curious how your government views the position that it is in with respect to managing and developing this very important sector where you have very large powers and their affiliated companies coming to your country. How do you approach the management of the sector, and then more broadly the kind of geostrategic implications that come, with that responsibility?
I think it's very much linked to our approach to our extractive industry and the shift that President Tshisekedi has opted for. For a very long time, our extractive industry, our mining sector was just that, extraction, nothing else. And President Tshisekedi is very intent on making sure that we, as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, occupy a seat at the table and a seat on value chains. And for now, we have only been the starting point, if you want, of the whole journey that strategic minerals go through until they end up in our car batteries or in our phones. We have just been the starting point and have never been, in a position to contribute to the rest of the conversation. And I think this is where we want to have that strategic shift. And I think this is also where we start creating opportunities for a mindset of partnership that is not exclusive and that is not limited to a handful of stakeholders. If you limit your economy only to extraction, then you just have a handful of stakeholders. Whereas if you invest in adding value to minerals before they are exported, when you invest in building infrastructure, when you invest in human capital, you have a whole array of segments that develop and that create space also for other partners. And I always, insist on the fact that, be it in the mining sector or in any other sector of our economy, because there are so many opportunities beyond mining in the DRC, we do not look at partnerships and at investments from a perspective of exclusivity, but rather one of complementarity. One that acknowledges the fact that you have superpowers, you have mid-sized powers, and you have aspiring powers, and all sorts of stakeholders who are specialized in particular areas. But it is only when you open up your value chain to add more transformation, to add more steps, that you create that space for those stakeholders to also participate in your economy. And this is why it is so critical for us as a DRC to shift away from an economy that, and especially a mining sector, that focuses solely on the extraction. And so when it comes to looking at the US, that has a keen interest on being more present, being more, having a greater role in our mining sector, but also on issues related to energy transition, then it is clearly for us an interesting and a big opportunity to have a new stakeholder that brings to the table another set of expertise, that brings to the table also another set of standards, of requirements, because it means that it gives us an opportunity for growth. Now, the challenge for all stakeholders is that we need to understand better how we ended up with the landscape that we have right now. Is it maybe linked to the fact that certain stakeholders have a different threshold for risk, a different appetite for risk? What is it about our business environment that has to be improved in order to make it more hospitable, to attract other investors, but also to attract other expertise that help us, again, as I said, diversify our economy further. And I think this is one of the key priorities that the government, the current government, has set for itself, to see how do we engage in these constructive conversations with strategic partners that we want to see in the DRC, that we want more of, that we know we can learn a lot from, but that are until now, just insufficiently present. And so this is also part of these conversations that we have here in Washington, D.C. This is part of this conversation that we have in order to see what is it that we need to do to better understand one another and to better work together, because that creates opportunity, and that creates not just opportunity for U.S. investors, but it creates opportunity for the DRC and for human capital.
Yeah. I appreciate that response. You touched on something that we here, at least in our little segment of the Africa program at CSIS, have this rather minority view that there needs to be more cooperation and, as you said, complementarity between the United States and China in Africa, but that Africans want that complementarity. They don't necessarily want the sort of zero-sum competition that's framed in this sort of geopolitical debates that we're having today. But if you have spent any time on Capitol Hill, or even with the current administration or the incoming administration, complementarity is not the word of the day. Competition is really the word of the day. And so I think this message of how we find ways to complement and cooperate is really going to be the thing that opens doors for the United States and for other countries and their industries. Is there something that you can do on your end to help promote that? Are there legislative tools? Are there bureaucratic or administrative tools that you're thinking about to help create opportunities for there to be more complementarity among competitive actors, rather than this kind of zero-sum, winner-take-all mentality, which seems to be, defining at least the mining sector in your country right now?
I just want to double-click on an important point that you made about the fact that African countries, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all African countries, but of course in the case of the DRC, and I would believe in the case of other countries, yes, we do not want to be trapped in this situation where we have to choose either or. And I think it's unfair, and it's unrealistic, and it doesn't reflect the realities in the rest of the world. No other country is put in front of that choice. No other continent is put in front of that choice. Even the US has trade relationships with China. And so, this expectation that for some reason the African continent must choose between one side or the other is, it's preposterous, because it is our entitlement, it is our right to choose how we see our development in the best possible way. And I believe that all other countries have also made use of that aspect of their sovereignty, have engaged in trade relationships as they wanted, with continents as they wanted. And so I think it's also a very, fundamental aspect of how do we relate to one another in terms of continents, and in terms of ideologically, how is it that we perceive one another, and what we are entitled to, and what we are allowed to in terms of self-determination and the determination of how we want to shape our futures, and how we want to make sure that is an entirely legitimate ambition, how we want to make sure that we create the best conditions for our people. So just as a little bracket that I wanted to make on the point you made on this issue of having to choose between one or the other. Now, looking at specific cases of how we can make this working together happen, I think it's still out there. I think there's going to be a need for a lot of creativity and show of innovation. At the same time, also a need of pragmatism. And I think that when people are on the ground, when people are actually doing business and they see the potential of business, it's much more easier to come up with solutions. It's much more easier to get people to work together. So I think that is also going to play a critical role. One area, of course, where we can think of such a convergence, if you want, of strategic interests actually coming, literally physically coming together, is the Lobito Corridor and the Tazara Railroad that connects the DRC to Tanzania via Burundi, and would basically have the potential of having a transcontinental railway, linking the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. So these are, very practical examples where we could project ourselves in seeing how can we make it work concretely. But I want to believe in the sometimes also opportunistic nature of investors and of business people who focus maybe more on the win and on the potential when they're on the ground and when they see the potential that working together can unlock. And I think this is a critical aspect that we can look forward to. But at the same time, I think also creating a conducive legal environment is certainly something that we can explore. And it would be also interesting to see to what extent other African countries have been experimenting in that regard, because again, I do not think that the DRC is a singular case. Certainly, we are a singular case when it comes to our endowment, but I don't think that it is a singular case when it comes to being in that reality of the geopolitical tension that we're observing right now.
Okay. I just want to remind folks we're going to go to some questions from the audience in just a minute. So have your questions ready. Your questions, I say, not your comments or your doctoral dissertations. We can take those offline. But I did want to ask one more question, and this is again a bit of a pivot back to the domestic politics in your country. I recognize that you're foreign minister, but you're here in Washington, and so I'm going to ask you. President Tshisekedi has alluded to certain constitutional revisions which might be on the horizon. I wonder if you can comment on what the prospects are, what the thinking is around those revisions, and why he's articulating those positions now.
Well, the thinking is very clear, and the thinking is not singular or particular to the DRC. It's thinking that you find in every dynamic society that questions itself and questions to what extent its legal framework matches its reality, matches its ambition. And the president has been very clear on that. There have been occurrences, there have been events that have led us to notice that there may be shortcomings in our constitution, that it may be not the best response to some of the realities on the ground compared to when the constitution was adopted in 2006 via referendum. And so the pathway has been very clearly spelled out by the president, including yesterday during his speech to Parliament. It is that there will be a commission that will be established, a commission that will establish a participative but also a transparent process to reassess the Constitution and identify the need, the pertinence of changes, amendments, and make recommendations. And I think until that commission is in place and until that process is concluded, everything else is speculation. Everything else is discussion and debate. We welcome it. We welcome it in the DRC because we are a very vibrant and vocal democracy, and it's completely normal. But at the same time, it is speculation, it is debate, it is discussion. It can inform also the process. But until the Commission has rendered, if you want, its recommendations and its final assessment, we have to wait in terms of what an eventual possible change or amendment of the Constitution would look like.
And there's no kind of expected set of outcomes that you're sort of describing a process that is very organic, and we will see where it goes. But oftentimes, other countries in Africa, the lesson we have taken from these kinds of processes is that in fact there is a kind of roadmap that might not be visible that is leading towards a certain set of outcomes. You're saying that's not the case here, that there's no intentionality behind this, that it will be a broad-based and organic process looking across the board, not at particular outcomes.
Indeed, and especially you can tell when you look at the debates that are happening now. I'm always just surprised at what different people suggest has to be amended in this constitution. So I think that already gives you an indication of the diversity of opinions and the extent to which it is, I want to say, unpredictable, because everyone has their reading and everyone has expectations and everyone sees, you know, advantages, disadvantages, shortcomings in the Constitution. And no, there is no premeditated outcome, if you want, and there is no steering of the process. And I think precisely because there is such a vibrant discussion around it, it would make it very difficult even. It would be a hard sell, you know, to have a premeditated or an outline, if you want, of what the outcome has to look like.
Great. Sorry, so we're going to go to questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work from the back forward, and I'm going to take two at a time. It's my rules. I'm sitting up here, so I get to make the rules, right?
I get to sit in the hot seat.
You get to sit in the hot seat, but you're an experienced minister, so you know how to not answer questions that you don't want to answer, and answer the ones that you do. So I'm going to go from back to forward. We're going to go two at a time, Alexis, and then in the back here, okay, in the way back. So we'll take those two first. And there is a microphone that's moving around.
Thank you. And thank you, Minister, for doing this session. I'm feeling vindicated in my seating choices. I wonder if we could loop back to the discussion of the concept of operations and the FDLR. So on behalf of your government, you declined to sign a version of the CONOPS back in September. So it would be great if you could shed light on what exactly changed. Was it something about the text or its interpretation? Any light you can shed would be very appreciated. And then to go a bit further, if you can talk about what you see as the concrete next steps in this concept of neutralization. Is this primarily a military operation, or are there other, proposals that you and others are looking at? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
And then we had one back here. In the way back, Fatima. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. I'm Dennis Owin from Uganda, but now based in DC. Welcome to the East African community. My question is about the role of the East African community in ensuring accountability in the peace process. So I'd like to find out whether you think there are some roles which the EAC can play in making sure that the peace process is respected, not just by the rebel group, but also by stakeholders like countries that are involved in that conflict.
Thank you. Those are great questions.
Those are great questions.
Yeah. So the first one was on FDLR. What has changed in the concept of operations to cause you to sign on now, and what are the next steps beyond neutralization?
Sure. So I won't delve into too many details because the peace process in itself, and as participants in the peace process, we did take a commitment towards the facilitator to treat information, with a certain level of confidentiality. On the issue of the initial CONOPS, it was an effort that was done by experts that were mandated by the ministerial meeting, and were tasked with elaborating this CONOPS. The CONOPS was then presented at our level and did not match certain of our expectations. I think critical expectations in terms of timelines and making sure that these efforts, both in terms of neutralization of the FDLR and in terms of the disengagement of Rwandan forces, that are mutually reinforcing. Without delving into too much detail, the two go hand in hand if you have a bit of a detailed understanding of the operational dimension of what it looks like to conduct a military operation in an area that is occupied by a foreign army. And so these were some of the intricacies that were, insufficiently developed. On the issue of what operations against, or what the neutralization of the FDLR would look like, I won't go into the details of the CONOPS, but I think that past operations are a good reference point. Past operations have had results, and I think, again, this would be maybe a reference that could be useful to have an idea of what is upcoming. But again, a bit of patience and a bit of luck. If we have an agreement signed on the 15th, then it will take just a few days to have a clearer understanding of what that means concretely. The second question on accountability within the EAC, and I want to open it up actually a bit further to even include the African Union, because I think this is a fundamental conversation that I try to encourage other of my colleagues to engage and to embark on. And I know these are difficult conversations, but it's centering back to our commitments as states when we adhere to these different bodies and to these different organizations, be it the AU Constitutive Act, be it our agreements to adhere to the East African Community. These are all legally binding commitments that we make, and they have to hold value. Before we go to the United Nations Security Council, we ought to be able to have sanctions coming from our AU Peace and Security Council. I think we speak a lot about African solutions to African problems. I think there's a whole strata of subtext that I could have on that specific expression. But there is a truth to it when it comes to us wanting to have ownership of our own destiny. When it comes to us having commitments, having legally binding commitments, and not respecting them. And I think these are difficult conversations to have because it is difficult to tell your neighboring country, you're not playing by the rules. And even though you and I are brothers and sisters, even though our communities have been separated by very random borders that were drawn up by, colonizers, the reality is, at a certain point, we agreed to play by certain rules, and we have to stick to those rules. So yes, there is a need for greater accountability, but I think it is a very difficult conversation to have, but a necessary one. And I think that the main impetus, I believe, is likely to come when it comes through the African Union, and then subsequently also trickles down to the different regional economic communities.
All right, we're going to go back. We'll do this young lady here and this gentleman. Fatima, why don't we go to this gentleman over here first, since we're working our way forward. We're going to make it, don't worry.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Nyonsenga, and I would first like to thank you, Your Excellency, for taking your time to be here with us from your busy schedule. My questions are complementary in nature, and I would like to hear from you since you're best suited to answer them.
Could you speak up a little?
Yes.
Can we turn the mic up a little?
Yes, just a little bit.
I was born in Rwanda and raised in America, where I've been a victim of Kagame's transnational repression, which makes adaptation paramount to my safety. And a while back, James Kabarebe, a retired Rwandan official who currently serves as Minister of State for Regional Cooperation in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and who has been deemed to be guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity by a UN report, both in DRC and Rwanda, if tried under a competent court, stated on Rwanda national television while serving as a special advisor to the president on security, that he was hell-bent on hunting and killing individuals such as myself wherever we are, simply because we are educated and contribute our talents to our host countries. What words of encouragement do you have for my peers and I who want to see and be a part of sustainable development in the DRC and the African Great Lakes region under the umbrella of democratic institutions? And finally, last year, the FBI and other
agencies... Can we just do one question? I want to get as many... I know we have a lot of hands. Can we just do the one question,
yes,
please?
just
Thank
one
you.
question, yes.
Thank you. That was your question. You asked your question. Thank you. We're going to move over here, Fatima, to this person here. This young lady up in the second row. And if you could identify yourself as well. I'm sorry, I should have said that.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My name is Jasmine. I'm a master's student in the Foreign Service program at Georgetown. My question is from a bit of a historical lens. Do you think that the failures of the international community in addressing what happened in Rwanda and the failures of the peacekeeping process that took place subsequently can kind of inform the conflict that's happening in the DRC and just the region in general today? And what lessons do you think we can take now from what happened in Rwanda in going forward?
Thank you. Are we just those two?
We're going to take those two, yeah.
Perfect. So I'm going to start with the gentleman's question in terms of words of encouragement. I think it's a sensitive issue because I speak on behalf of the DRC, and I find it delicate to speak on behalf of another country, especially for the reason that Rwanda has been using the pretext of what is going on in our country to violate our sovereignty and our territorial integrity. I think every country has its trajectory, its struggles and trials and tribulations. From the experience in the DRC, I can say that, and I said it before, we have a very vibrant and a vocal democracy. Yes, sometimes it means that it stalls. Sometimes it means that it takes longer to get somewhere. But from our experience and from my lived experience, I think this is how societies have a greater chance of success and of stability on the long run. And so, you know, this is maybe for me the takeaway that I have from the DRC, that a society thrives when it enables all its members to participate and to voice their views without fear or threats. And I know it is a journey, and different countries are at different stages of that journey. On the question regarding the international community and I would say the imperative to learn from past experiences, I think it takes a lot of courage. I think it takes a lot of courage to acknowledge the fact that recipes that have been applied in certain contexts have not had the expected result. Also because it means that somehow you have to explain why you spent millions and billions and did not get the outcome you expected. But at the same time, and this is where the DRC is also a masterclass in itself. At the same time, there is a potential for growth. There is a potential for learning. There's a lot of areas where peacekeeping was transformed in the DRC and was improved from the DRC onto other countries. You know, when you look, for example, at civilian liaison officers or assistants that were created or, devised in the MONUSCO peacekeeping mission, that was an outcome of the fact that people realized that you had peacekeepers in communities that didn't speak the language and that had, pardon my French, but absolutely no clue what was going on. And equipping them with liaison assistants that were from the communities meant that they were much more efficient in their protection of civilians' jobs. But this is something that came from the DRC and then was exported in other peacekeeping missions. So there is learning, and there is a need to make sure that that learning is channeled and streamlined. When we look at the crises right now in the DRC and the greater Great Lakes region, I think that there needs to be more courage in terms of what other lessons there are that have to be drawn. And I think that there's a wealth of lessons that were drawn from the shortcomings and the failings of the international community during the Rwandan genocide, and that it has, in a very constructive manner, I hope, led to, rethinking also the international order. But at the same time, there is a need to also take stock of what has happened in the region since 1994 and courageously look at that and think how that can inform other policies and other postures, including in the UN and the Security Council.
Thank you. Okay, we've got time for one more round of questions. So we're going to go over here and then here, okay? And that's going to be our, so where is our microphone? Fatima, can you come over here? This gentleman here, second in. And then
Sure thing. Former Minister, thank you very much for coming today. My name is Carson Keller. I'm an intern with the Missile Defense Program and a student at Missouri State University pursuing a master's in strategic studies. My question's a bit pointed here, but I want to ask it anyway. Given that the Rwandan state invaded the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its preceding state, Zaire, in the First and Second Congo Wars, given that it supported the M23 rebel movement in 2012 and into the present, and having conducted numerous cross-border violations of the DRC sovereignty, I must ask, do you believe that they will adhere to the Luanda process?
Why don't we go here, and then we'll go to you, Mel. Thank you.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I'm 82 years old, happily married for 60 years, but I fell in love with you. I did not know, I knew your name. I watched you Chatham House. I watched you here. You are really good, and so on, using diplomatic language and so on. I follow, well, one, I don't buy this comparison between M23 and FDLR. I mean, it's a made-up thing, but you're diplomatic, so we agree. I, however, focus on economic issues, and basically, one, there's a great opportunity for the Congo because the ministers, the Africans chose you to host the next AGOA forum. I think AGOA will pass, hopefully this week. Hopefully will include provisions on critical minerals, which are important, and on rules of origin so you can use your free trade zones and so on. However, this is a great opportunity. I was part of the advisor on the negotiations, which resulted in the privileged partnership that was formed under the first Trump administration. I think we can build on that very much so. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that people will realize that the Lobito corridor could be the banana corridor or the Bama category, but it would be nice to also go up to the Atlantic coast as well as on the Pacific coast. And my real question is, just to get it real quickly, is this administration is focusing on a transactional approach. What President Felix did, which was not appreciated in the American press, when he came in, he said, I do want to have fair relationship. Some of our contracts with China may be questionable. I will renegotiate them. No U.S. business, from what I understood, stood up and said, here is an opportunity. What do you think? Do you think the Congo is ready and can actually participate in a transactional approach with specific projects ready to go? Again, thank you so much for coming, but I know how busy your schedule is. And thank you very much for giving us DCM Shaku and Dominique. We need an ambassador, but you have a great number of people holding the fort here, so we appreciate that. Thank you.
Can you pass the mic over? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Melvin Foote, and I'm the president of the Constituency for Africa. We are an African diaspora organization that lobbies the U.S. government on Africa policy. We're in the process of preparing our recommendations for the U.S. policy toward Africa to the Trump administration. We gave the policy to Biden that resulted in YALI, resulted in a number of initiatives. My question to you is, do you have any recommendations? We're in the process of preparing our recommendation. Do you have any advice in terms of your perspective on what would you like to see from a U.S. policy toward Africa? Then the second part of the question is the continental free trade area. What do you think the prospects for that in Africa? Congo is a critical country. You're right in the middle of the continent. It's not going to happen unless Congo really does, So I would appreciate any thoughts you have on the continental free trade area.
So that's a lot to end on.
That is a lot to end on. I'll start with the first question. Yes, it is a provocative question. And time will tell. History tells one part of the story, but we can't foretell the future. From a position of the DRC, we cannot afford to get tired of trying to find peace. I started my career in Eastern DRC. I started my career as a humanitarian. I worked in the Goma IDP camps with people who fled from the M23, first edition, as I like calling it. And so there is a moral debt that we have as leaders towards the people in Eastern DRC who do not get to be at the table, who do not get to sit here and tell the stories. And that moral debt means that we cannot afford to get tired of trying to find peace. At the same time, history will judge us, and I think you had a very compelling summary of how some countries in the region have been behaving. And I think this is where, at the end of the day, we all have to be accountable towards our own conscience. We will never get tired of trying to find peace and of trying to create an environment that enables all Congolese citizens to realize their aspirations, which are just as valid as those of people on the other side of the border. And I cannot get stalled by speculating on the goodwill or lack thereof of others. Of course, I hold them accountable. I hold them accountable based on their actions. That I do. But I don't speculate, and I don't project myself in such a way that would, have a stalling effect, if you want, on the efforts. The second question was,
is Congo prepared to be transactional and meet the transactional nature of the Trump administration?
Yes, of course, and that's precisely what I was getting at. The need for us also to engage in very pragmatic conversations, conversations that enable us to be more transactional. What is it that makes it difficult for U.S. investors to operate in the DRC? Understanding that better and signaling to others that we're willing to go the extra mile, that we're willing to make the adjustments that are necessary. And I think this is what makes the difference, if you want, in terms of our previous approaches. The need to be more cognizant of the differences that investors bring to the table in terms of their risk appetite. Again, I do not believe that it has been, a strategic choice and a policy decision to say the mining sector will be dominated only by country X. I would rather say it is a result of the nature of the context and of the fact that certain stakeholders are just willing to go for it, and they're just willing to take the risk and to say, you know what, if the others are, asking thousands of questions and coming with all of their forms and all of their questionnaires and so on and so forth, we're going to go for it. And this is more the result of it. At the end of the day, is it beneficial for us? No, it isn't. And so we need to do our homework and engage in those constructive conversations of understanding what is it that we need to do about our context, our landscape, to make it more, our business environment, to make it more welcoming to others.
And then the last question was both your views on the African Continental Free Trade Area, what is Congo's position on that? And then I think a great question to end on is, what are your recommendations for the incoming Trump administration about their approach to Africa, if I got that right?
Exactly. So on the first question, you said it. I think, but at the same time, no country is indispensable. No country is going to be to make or break the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But we are cognizant of our strategic position. I think the challenge is seeing how a country like the DRC, that is in certain areas still establishing systems, still establishing legislation, matches the speed of other countries and makes sure that it maintains, if you want, opportunities also for its own population. And I think this is a challenge that everyone grapples with. When you look at the African continent and the different African economies, you have some that are moving at a different pace and at a different speed, and you have others that are still latching on, and you have others in between. And I think this is one of the main reasons why the project in itself is taking the time that it needs to be fully integrated and fully operational in a seamless manner, because unfortunately we are not all starting at the same level. But I think we're very aware of the fact that the potential is immense within the continent in itself, and we're very cognizant of the fact that interconnection within the continent, and in a country like the DRC, which is in itself nearly a continent, interconnection plays a critical role. And so I think there is a greater appetite throughout the African continent to see how we can invest more in terms of infrastructure, in terms of trade, in terms of people moving across borders, because we see ourselves the amount of wealth that has been untapped within the continent. And I think this is a great opportunity that all countries see, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that the starting points are not necessarily always the same. The second question was...
What recommendations do you want to leave with the Trump administration for their approach to Africa?
I think we have, in the case of the DRC, the advantage of being able to look back at the first Trump administration in a very positive manner, and look back at a partnership that laid down the foundation for a more structured relationship between the two countries. In terms of advice, I think, one issue that is central is engaging with African stakeholders from a perspective of shared interests and mutual interests. I think at the end of the day, we're not that different one from another, right? We want our people to live in safety. We want our people to have perspectives. We want our people to have jobs. And I think an interest-based approach is one that enables us to look beyond what appears to be or what appear to be differences. That would be a fundamental starting point. On the other hand, President-elect Trump has been very vocal about putting an end to some very prominent conflicts around the world. He's spoken about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East. And I think, critical recommendation that I would make is also having a look at what is going on the African continent, because again, Africa is at the heart of all the strategic decisions and all the strategic crossroads that our world as a whole is going to face in the next decades, whether it's in terms of demographics, whether it's in terms of climate change, whether it's in terms of energy transition, critical minerals. Most of the answers to these challenges will be found in Africa, but they will not be found in a sustainable manner. They will not be found in a constructive manner if we do not solve the problem of peace and if we do not put an end to conflict. And this is why it has to be a priority, just as it is a priority in other regions. It has to be a priority for such a global force like the USA to privilege peace and to use its leverage to hold all parties accountable towards their debt, towards their populations and future generations, in creating an environment where everyone lives peacefully and where the potential that we have can be leveraged in order to create better conditions.
I think that's a great message to end on. I want to thank you so much for being as generous with your time and joining us today and being as open with the questions. And I want to thank you for coming and ask you to join me in thanking the Honorable Minister for her comments today.
Thank you so much.